welcome to the Environmental Psychology Groningen podcast. The goal of this show is to hear from the researchers directly who are doing studies within this department and to understand all the different facets of environmental psychology. And to that end, we're speaking with one of the postdocs in our department today, Anne van Valkengoed.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us here in the office.
Of course.
Yes. And the topic that we were going to discuss today is adaptation. And why that is an important concept to understand within environmental psychology. So I think people know sort of the term, but within climate science or climate change more generally, what does adaptation mean? Can you give some examples of what that actually means?
Of course. So very briefly describing an adaptation is coping with or adjusting to the impacts of climate change. So within IPCC, the IPCC reports, so the reports that are written by this huge team of scientists for the United Nations, you mainly have two pillars. So you have mitigation and you have adaptation. So mitigation is what I think everybody thinks of when we're talking about climate change and protecting the climate. It's reducing CO2 emissions, it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to stop climate change as much as we can. Yeah. This is also, for example, the Paris Agreement goal of limiting climate change to 2 degrees, that's mitigation.
So is it like prevention, mitigation?
Right, exactly. It's preventing climate change from happening altogether. Whereas adaptation is coping with and adjusting to the impacts of climate change that we can no longer avoid. So at this point in time, we are actually already experiencing some of the impacts of climate change. We're currently at, I think, 1.1 degree of global warming already. So some amount of warming since the pre-industrial era has already happened, has already occurred to us. So already we are seeing the impacts of that unfolding. Some examples of this include, for example, extreme cases of flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves, especially last summer across the globe. I think there were many of these kinds of very large-scale natural hazards and disasters happening. So I think we are
exacerbated by climate change.
Exactly, and these are exactly the kinds of risks that are exacerbated by climate change. They are not only going to occur more frequently, but they also increase in severity, so they become more extreme over time. And taking measures to protect ourselves against these kinds of impacts, that's what we refer to when we are talking about climate change adaptation.
And I think that for a long time the conversation has been about trying to focus on mitigation sort of at all costs, like try to prevent it. That seems to be the logical thing to aim for. But can adaptation and mitigation coexist, or are they mutually exclusive, or do they cancel each other out? Like how do they relate to each other?
Yes, so at this point in time, I think adaptation is necessary. It's become a necessary part of our response to climate change. You're right in saying that before, and I think this was especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s, adaptation was still a strategy that was a little bit taboo within climate science as well as climate policy and the overall discourse on climate change, because it was seen as kind of an easy way out. You know, if we just adapt to the consequences of climate change, then people were afraid that, you know, if we start focusing on adaptation too much, we might lose sight of the goal of mitigating climate change, and ultimately prevention is better than curing, right? So there's also this idea of
the medical sort of mentality.
Exactly. Why would you why would you adapt to something you can prevent altogether? But this, you know, in the 1990s, of course, the state of the climate was quite different. Now we're 30 years in the future. We're here, as I just mentioned, we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. So we're at this point where adaptation is not something that we can still consider doing as an option. It's something that's become necessary that we do.
Because, not hypothetical.
No, because even if tomorrow we would halt all of our emissions, so if we could completely bring down our emissions to zero tomorrow, there would still be the consequences of climate change that are already locked in, because there is some level of climate change that we are already locked into at this point in time. So adaptation is necessary.
Yeah, but it's not the same as sort of like giving up on things. So that's not a fair sort of comparison to make, because it is something that's maybe not a good faith argument, but it's something that gets said sometimes.
Yeah. I also see indeed sometimes people might interpret it also this way. But I think IPCC is also very clear on that we cannot let go of our mitigation goals and just adapt instead. Because IPCC is pretty clear in saying that if we don't mitigate, the impacts of climate change will be severe to such an extent that adaptation isn't even possible anymore. Because it will just completely have this runaway effect, and then even adaptation is no longer an option either. So we really do need this combination of mitigation as well as adaptation. Yeah,
and is this something that needs to be happening necessarily on all levels, or is there more of an onus on like the big polluters and the big institutions that are contributing the most to climate change, or is there a role for individuals to play within adaptation as well?
Within adaptation, I do really think that individual people also really have a role to play here. And there's a lot you can do, and also that studies show that individual actions contribute in protecting people against climate change impacts. For example, there are a few studies that show that if people take appropriate measures during a heat wave, this can really have a big impact in avoiding deaths, avoiding morbidity during a heat wave event. So I'm talking about really basic things like making sure you're dressed lightly, you're wearing airy clothing, making sure you're heating and cooling the room, making sure you're drinking enough water. So kind of basic things can go a very long way in really reducing the impact of a heat wave.
Yeah, but not necessarily something as intense as like installing an air conditioner or something like that, because I mean, like many sorts of interventions, there's other consequences that come along with it, but simple things that are affordable for people to do, sort of regardless of their financial status, maybe.
So air conditioning is a bit of a conflicting kind of behavior, because on the one hand, of course, air conditioning is going to be very effective in reducing the impacts of heating and overheating. But then the problem with air conditioning is, of course, what are you using to power your air conditioning? So if many people start using it and it's fossil fuel run, you're actually making the problem worse in the long run. And there's actually a word for this, it's called maladaptation. So they are adaptation actions that in the long run make climate change worse. So it's also another example would be if you're a government, you're building enormous seawalls, the CO2 impact of the cement and the steel that goes into these constructions ultimately also has a big carbon footprint. So kind of managing your adaptation, but making sure you're not kind of pushing us over the edge in terms of mitigation is something that needs to be in balance.
And is that also true for energy provisions as well? Like with solar panels and wind turbines, there are certain elements that go into them that they're not, it's not like very, the products themselves are not emitting carbon, but maybe the process of making them also has a carbon footprint. But how does that fit within adaptation?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on this particular point, because I think you can do these life cycle analyses and then you can calculate, okay, what's the net effect of, for example, installing solar panels. There's also, I notice many people question whether purchasing an electric vehicle, for example, is good for the environment or not, because of the costs and the materials that go into building the electric vehicles, especially the batteries is something people get concerned about. Okay, what goes into them? These are rare, precious metals. Is that ultimately good for the environment?
Is that sustainable?
Yeah, is that even sustainable?
But it's long term versus short term a lot of times with the adaptations.
So these are very complicated questions, and it depends on how you calculate it. But ultimately, I do think, but again, I'm not an expert on this exact question, that many of these actions, like putting down solar panels, having the windmills, they have a net positive effect if you take the whole life cycle of the product into account.
And then something that we study a lot within environmental psychology in lots of different, the things I write about that you research, to be clear, is the role that people's beliefs and values play in the actions that they take. So within adaptation, are there any particular beliefs or certain kinds of values that make it likelier that people will adapt, or that they'll be more resistant to adaptation?
This is an interesting question. When we started researching adaptation, I was reading these papers and I noticed that most of the articles point to two factors that would motivate people's adaptation action. Mm-hmm. And one of those is risk perception. So it's whether people perceive themselves as being at risk of a climate-related hazard happening. So do I perceive myself as at risk of being affected by a flood or a heat wave?
Will it personally affect me?
Yeah, will it personally affect me? A component of risk perception is also the probability of something happening. Mm-hmm. So how likely do I think a heat wave is going to affect me?
Yeah.
So this risk perception was one part of it, and then there's also experience. So a lot of papers write about how if people experience, say, a flood, of course you don't want that to happen to you the next time around. So experiencing something directly can be a strong motivating factor for people to take these kinds of measures to make sure, the next time a flood comes around, you'll stay safe.
Yeah. So it has to happen directly to you in some cases for it to be something that you really believe in, maybe. Yeah, but, or understand fully.
But the interesting thing is, so these were the two main factors that were most frequently discussed in this literature. And we were doing a meta-analysis on this paper, and one of the questions we had is, okay, is this all there is to it? So is just risk perception and just people's experiences enough to motivate them to adapt, or are there other factors that come into play as well? Because we know from the literature on pro-environmental behavior that it's quite complex, and there are quite some factors that determine when people do not act pro-environmentally. So, for example, people's values come into play, worldviews, their sense of self-efficacy, also contextual factors. So
Can you explain efficacy too for the non-experts?
So self-efficacy, it refers to this sense or perception that people have that they are able or capable of performing a particular action. So for example, in the context of climate change adaptation, if you're at risk of flooding, you might want to implement flood protection measures in and around your house. Your sense of self-efficacy would be the extent to which you feel like you can actually implement those measures. Okay. And efficacy can be determined by different factors. It can be really practical, like, do I have time to do this? Do I have the money to do this? Can I pay for these measures? But also more psychological, like, do I know how to do this? Do I know what measures I even can take or should take, or how should I take them? So your sense of self-efficacy there can be determined by different kinds of factors as well.
I mean, that's something that I am finding even just in trying to adapt my own household, not necessarily preparing it for flooding, but just trying not to exacerbate things, but trying to have a heat pump or trying to have an induction stove or like install a ceiling fan. All of those things involve a level of knowledge of wiring and technology that I don't necessarily have. So it is a sense of the sort of thing that I can't make that thing happen in my own house. I'm reliant on a few different steps to make that happen. Is that also, I mean, it's like not emergency level adaptation, but are those sorts of things also considered as adaptive measures that people can take?
Yeah. So anything that basically makes your life easier in the face of climate change risks, we can consider adaptation. So you can imagine that this covers a lot of ground. It can really range from really extreme emergency kinds of behaviors, like evacuating when there's a hurricane coming, to much smaller things. For example, in my PhD research, we were looking at whether people in the Netherlands have a green garden or whether they have a rain barrel. Making sure they are collecting rainwater on their own property, because you can use that to water your own garden, and that's a good measure against drought, which is going to be an issue here in Netherlands. So
already is, but increasingly common and more extreme, as you say.
So it could even be those smaller things. Also, just making your house, taking measures so it's a little bit cooler during a heat wave, can also be these smaller things. So anything that really helps you to adjust to the changing climate, we consider adaptation.
And what role do subsidies play in enabling people to take these adaptive adapted. I will figure out how to pronounce it by the end of this conversation. To take these measures for adaptation.
Yeah.
And I found a way to get there.
I've been saying adaptive up until this point. I don't know.
Now you're questioning everything. Adaptive is correct. You are the person who's been studying this. Adaptive.
I hope so. I hope I'm correct. Subsidies. Yes, so I actually wanted to loop back to one more thing, otherwise we leave that unaddressed. I mentioned something on how we were doing this meta-analysis and wanted to know what else comes into play for people's adaptation behavior in addition to their perceived risks and their experience with climate-related hazards. So one of the things we already discussed a little bit, so it's self-efficacy. So this extent to which people feel like I can do this. This is something I'm capable of doing. Another factor that comes into play is also outcome efficacy. So it's this perception of, is what I'm doing effective?
Does it make a difference?
Does it make a difference? If I'm taking all of these measures, does it actually or does it actually help me cope better with these climate change impacts? Because if you feel like you can do a lot of things, but none of those things are really going to make a difference, also that can be a barrier to actually engaging in adaptive actions. And a last thing I also wanted to mention, I mean, in the literature review we did quite a surprising number of different psychological drivers of adaptation behavior did come up, so that might be interesting to know that kind of similar to mitigation behavior or pro-environmental behavior, we did see that kind of a broad range of different factors came up. Some of them were also quite similar to pro-environmental behavior, which I also find quite interesting because they are usually mitigation behavior and adaptation behaviors are studied
as separate things.
Kind of as separate things. They're usually not addressed within the same papers, and most theorizing also is really on either one or the other, so they're not really, considered siblings as they should be. I think
complementary.
So they're now mostly treated as two completely different fields of study. It's I feel it's a bit odd, since it seems like the drivers of these behaviors are quite similar, maybe not completely the same, but still overlapping to such an extent that I feel it would warrant a bit more attention to bring those a bit closer together.
Then, as you say, the mitigation and adaptation, they are complementary and quite common and may have similar motivators, but one of the barriers to efficacy is money for people. And research from this group has shown that subsidies can play a role in sort of encouraging people, but not always to the extent that people think. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Of course. So one of the papers I did during my PhD was a paper indeed on the use of subsidies in the context of climate change adaptation behavior in the Netherlands. We noticed that many municipalities in the Netherlands have a scheme subsidizing individual households to take adaptation measures. This is quite common, and it's available in different municipalities with slight changes in how it's exactly implemented, because municipalities can decide. They have quite a big range in how they set up such a subsidy scheme. But we got a nice opportunity to work together with a city in the south of the Netherlands, namely the city of Breda. They were going to implement a subsidy scheme for climate adaptation measures, very broadly defined. So if people could prove somehow the measures they were taking would improve their resilience against climate-related risks. So very broadly defined, they could get subsidy for taking those measures. And the city of Breda really wanted to know, okay, is this really the most effective way to motivate people to take adaptation measures? Because generally we do see that many municipalities in the Netherlands recognize the important role that individuals and households play. Within Dutch cities, I think 50 to 70% of all of the land is privately owned by either businesses or individuals, individual homes. So if you want to make a city more climate resilient, you're really going to have to bring those businesses and those individual households on board in kind of your adaptation strategy. Because as a municipality, there's a lot you can do, of course, but because so much of the area or the ground in a city is privately owned, you are going to have to bring them on board with you as if you're a municipality. So,
because as the government, you can make sort of mandates or recommendations for public property, but you can't force that on private homes.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So a lot of Dutch cities they recognize this challenge of how do we motivate individual households to take adaptation measures. And within the Dutch context, this is mostly measures to reduce the risks of pluvial flooding. So that's flooding caused by rainfall. Okay. So you have fluvial flooding, that's rivers going over their banks and flooding in this way. And but you also have pluvial flooding, that's when there's very heavy rainfall. If you don't have good drainage, or you have a lot of asphalt, a lot of stones, it will...
The runoff.
Exactly. Yeah. So that can also cause... flooding. So in the Dutch context, we're mostly talking about pluvial flooding, we're talking about drought, that's a big issue, and we're talking about heat. And the thing that Dutch households can really do against that is, if you have a garden, make sure it's green.
As opposed to covered in
stones, tiles.
Do some tegelwippen.
Exactly. Tegelwippen is a very famous example of this kind of climate adaptation.
For non-Dutch speakers, it's chucking the tiles out of your garden.
Exactly. Yeah.
And not hitting people. I don't know all the rules of this game, but the concept is get the tiles out.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's they set it up as like a competition between cities, and then the city where most people remove the most tiles from their front and back gardens, then you win. Then it's also called NK Tegelwippen, so it's the Dutch competition or national championship.
Yes, the championship between two cities.
Exactly.
Yes.
So this is really what we're talking about in the Dutch context. And so going back to the story of subsidies, where we got a little bit off track there, I feel.
It's all useful information.
So the city of Breda wanted to know, okay, is a subsidy really the best way of getting people to do all of this, to get the stones out of their gardens, make the gardens green, install a green roof, which is another example of a climate adaptation measure. So if you don't know, if you have a flat roof, you can have a green, you can make it green, and you can put little plants on them, and they store water. And also the added benefit is it also has this effect that if you just have a flat roof, it will get super hot in summer, especially if it's this black asphalt on top. But if you have this green roof, the plants will kind of absorb that heat, so also inside your house it will get less hot. So it's kind of a 2-in-1. So it retains moisture, retains the water, but at the same time also it keeps your house cooler in summer. So
and the bees are happy.
The bees are happy. Also it contributes to biodiversity, so it's kind of a triple win. So this is also an example of a kind of an adaptation behavior individual households can do. So is a subsidy the way to get people to take these kinds of measures? That's essentially the question here. Because it's good to know that a subsidy is not the only thing a government could do. Other examples are, for example, taxing people who have a garden with lots of stone and asphalt in it. This is something that's being seriously considered in some municipalities, that you would pay more municipal tax if you don't have a green garden. So this is more of a punishment. So this is not uncontroversial, I would say. I mean,
I can imagine.
In general, we know from the environmental psychology literature that these are so-called push measures, so kind of punishing people if they don't, they do the undesirable behavior. They are usually far less popular than pull measures, which is rewarding people when they do the behavior that the municipality wants. So in this case, a subsidy is an example of a pull measure. So in theory, I mean, sounds nice because you take the adaptation measures and then they reimburse part of your costs. So we wanted to see, indeed, does this make people want to take these actions more? Because we were thinking we can only really call a subsidy effective if the people who applied for the subsidy are also people who wouldn't have taken the measure without the subsidy. Because we already knew from previous literature, also more general, not even specifically climate related, that usually subsidies are applied for by people who have taken the measures anyway. But then because the subsidy is in place, it's kind of a nice bonus. It's a windfall rather than really a motivating factor.
So people who have the financial means to do these adaptation measures anyway may not do it until there's a subsidy. Is that sometimes the case, or like does that prevent people who are less financially able from applying for them, or does financial status not have something to do with it? It's just about the willingness to take the measure anyway.
Well, so what we found was that we had a survey among people who didn't apply for the subsidy and also those who did apply for the subsidy, and we could compare them. And what we found was that people who applied for the subsidy generally were already highly motivated to take these adaptation measures. So, for example, they had very strong climate perception, so they were concerned about climate change. They saw it as a risk. They also perceived risks for themselves from climate-related hazards. They had high levels of self-efficacy, as we just discussed. So they felt capable of taking the measures. So across all of these different psychological factors that we asked for, we saw that the subsidy applicants already scored very highly on all of those. So in general, across the board, they were highly motivated to take these measures anyway. And we also asked them directly. We had a question where we asked them, if you hadn't heard about the subsidy, would you still have taken the measures? And then most people actually said yes. So it seems like the subsidy was mostly applied for by people who would have taken the measures anyway. It was
just kind of a reminder that this is something they were planning to do, sort of.
So we also asked people, okay, what did the subsidy kind of do for you? Did it make you aware you could take these measures? Did it kind of remind you were going to do it, and now you took concrete steps because you knew the subsidy was in place? So we kind of asked for these kinds of questions, and there you do see most people say the subsidy kind of works as a reminder rather than a motivator. So for most of these people, they already had the plan to do it anyway, and then the subsidy came around and it's kind of timely, and they realized, oh yeah, I was going to do that anyway, let me do it now, and then I can get the subsidy.
So then it plays a role, but not the role that people expect it to play necessarily.
Exactly. Because often when we implement a scheme like this, we're really thinking this is going to motivate people. But I think in this case, many of, or even most of these people were already motivated. It was just that they were nudged a little bit, or reminded almost, to take the measure. So does that mean the subsidy is completely a failure? I wouldn't say. I mean, it did definitely do something, and it was, in terms of applications, a great success. Many people applied for the subsidy, so that means many people are taking these adaptation measures. Which is really good, because that in itself makes adaptation more visible. It can have a social effect. So, if some people start taking these measures, others will see it, they will learn about it. So it
normalizes it if you see that your neighbors have solar panels.
So it can have this kind of snowballing effect in that way.
There were a couple of other things that you've researched that I wanted to ask about as they connect to adaptation, but also just a little bit more generally. One thing that you've written quite a bit about is the concept of climate anxiety. And maybe could you explain a little bit about what that is, and then explain how, or if, that connects to people's ability, or at least their willingness to take adaptive measures?
Sure. So climate anxiety, we see a lot that, people are worried about climate change. Lots of people are very worried about climate change. But for some people, this worry is more than just a negative feeling sometimes, or, you open the news and you feel a bit concerned about it. For some people, it can really turn into more of this sense of anxiety. So anxiety traditionally is kind of defined as this slumbering, lingering feeling of anticipation that something bad is going to happen. And in the context of climate change, we usually define climate anxiety as this persistent, pervasive worrying about climate change. And it's not only that you feel negatively about it or feel continuously anxious about it, but it can also cause people to ruminate, or it can have an impact on even your day-to-day life, where you have troubles concentrating, trouble sleeping because of these continuous worries about climate change. So this is generally how we understand climate anxiety in the moment, at the moment in the literature. But I should add to this that at the moment there's no one definition that we all agree on, and it's been operationalized also quite in quite varying ways across different papers that have looked into this.
Yeah. And then that sense of, is it sort of people's sense of helplessness, or is it people that really do want to make a change and are motivated but then feel demotivated by the lack of progress? I mean, what are the things that contribute to people having climate anxiety?
I think there are a few things that come into play why people feel anxious. So the first and foremost is, of course, the enormous scale of the problem and how threatening it is. And it's even to the point where it's almost an existential threat, not only to many animals and plants and ecosystems on this planet, but also even for humanity itself. Yeah. So it's the scale of the threat combined with the fact that we've known about this for a long time, and then the progress that we've made in reducing CO2 emissions just hasn't been sufficient. So it's this combination of this enormous threat combined with the lack of progress, or the progress is not happening fast enough, and then there's this increasing time pressure. You also see this time pressure increasing if you read the IPCC reports. I think in the most recent report they talk about this rapidly closing window to ensure a just and sustainable future. So you really also see there's this language of time pressure and opportunities slipping away from us if we don't act within the next 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah. So these elements together really make this such an anxiety-inducing problem to think about.
Yeah. I mean, is that also a bit of a balancing act with the language that's used to describe it, to convey a sense of urgency, but also not to leave people feeling that there's not much they can do or that it is inevitable?
Yeah, this is a really good question. There's been a lot of, there's been papers looking into this doom versus hope kind of messaging since 2009 at least, I think. I find it difficult to give a concrete recommendation on what you should do, because it's always going to be a balancing act. Also, I'm trying to remember what have we seen in recent papers on this. It's difficult to draw a clear conclusion on what we know at the moment from this literature. Also because I think it's not as simple as you just need to make people scared, or you just need to give people hope, or what motivates people to engage in action for the climate is much more complex than just kind of how the problem is framed in terms of different emotions. And of course people are exposed to different kinds of climate messages the whole day long, so particular framing of one specific message completely changing people's entire outlook on this problem, I don't think is really how that works.
That's where the cumulative effect.
Exactly. Yeah. And ultimately it's going to be a combination of the more anxious, the more fearful, and maybe the more negative emotion combined with this feeling of that you can do something, that we must do something, that we must act. So I think
that you can act.
You can act, of course. So there's going to be always, I feel, this kind of combination of feelings that play a role in when and why people are going to act. And I never think you're going to have people who feel only negatively or only positively, or that it's either one of those emotions that brings about the action. I think it's the combined experience of all of those feelings ultimately that might move people to do something.
Yeah, and I think that sort of complexity of conflicting feelings happening simultaneously is something a lot of people can sort of relate to, that it's not just one simple thing and on any given day you feel differently about it based on what you have been reading or what you're able to do in your own community. And does environmental psychology have much to say in terms of helping people feel more empowered to take adaptive measures to try to do something to overcome their climate anxiety? Or is it something that needs to be overcome, or is it something that you can overcome? I speak English. Something that can be overcome, or is it something that people should sort of lean into and use as like a motivation to do things?
Yeah. This is, again, a really good question, because there's been some debate on whether climate anxiety is this motivating force for action or whether it's this paralyzing freezing response, and up until this point you see most papers kind of discussing both and speculating on whether there's this kind of invert like
the bell
this
curve, sort of.
Happening, so meaning that, you know, if you feel no anxiety, you don't have any kind of motivation to act. If you feel kind of a moderate level of anxiety, you should be most prone to act. But if you feel overwhelming levels of anxiety, your motivation to act will, again, you will completely just freeze because it's so overwhelming. So there's been this idea of this kind of inverted U curve happening there. But I have a student who's looking into what do we know at this point from the literature on how climate anxiety indeed relates to action. And there we actually see that most studies report a positive relationship. So people who have higher levels of climate anxiety generally also tend to report they are engaging in more climate action. So that's both more at the individual level, so taking actions to reduce your personal carbon footprint, but also actions more aimed at a collective level, so joining a climate protest, for example. And we haven't really seen any studies that show this kind of negative relationship. So this freezing or paralyzing effect of anxiety, we haven't really been able to see that much in the, at least, correlational studies that are out there.
Yeah, because I guess climate anxiety comes from the fact that you are very well aware of what the problem is.
Exactly.
I guess.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that would translate into you trying to prevent the problem from being worse. But then that's still putting it on you as an individual as well. And does that play a role in climate anxiety? The sense of, I have to do everything I can, but it may not make a difference, and other people aren't doing as much as they should, or other institutions of power aren't doing what they should?
Yeah, so there's definitely this feeling of unfairness in the sense that people with strong levels of climate anxiety, they usually feel like they are aware of the problem and would very much like to change what's happening, and they would very much like to stop or limit climate change as much as possible, but they perceive themselves as not powerful, whereas those people who are powerful, so politicians, CEOs, very influential figures, they see them as not caring about climate change. So again, you have this huge risk. We've known about it for a long time. We haven't acted, and then the people who want to do something and want to change something don't have that much power, and then the people who have that power, who could make the difference, are not acting. So there's definitely this feeling of the discrepancy there that really feeds into also this sense of anxiety. But still, even though this, how I've just portrayed it now, might give the sense that people feel powerless to act, still we see in the literature, at least, that people with high levels of climate anxiety, still they are acting, and they are engaging in climate action. They are acting more pro-environmentally. They are engaging also in these more collective action. And one explanation also for why we're seeing this is it could also be seen as a way to kind of reclaim your power, reclaim your control by engaging in these actions. So if you feel very anxious and powerless, one of the ways that you can regain a little bit that feeling of, okay, I can do something, is maybe just joining a protest or doing something in your direct environment.
Yeah, that was a quote that I read in a book called The Octopus in the Parking Garage, which I think I've loaned to you.
Yes, you have. Yeah.
It was from a scientist named Catherine Hayhoe, and the quote was attributed to her that it's, the antidote to anxiety is action.
Yeah.
We're just putting it in a really super pithy sort of way, but that sounds like that's what you're saying as well.
But I would want to add to this is that I've also written a piece that was a bit more critical of this idea of anxiety is the antidote to action, because within the larger discussion on climate anxiety, there's sometimes this idea of we shouldn't help people who are feeling anxious reduce their anxiety because the anxiety is essential to get them to do something. Right. And I've also heard people say things along the lines of we need people to be more anxious or we need more people to feel more anxiety. So I'm not completely sure if I agree with this specific interpretation of it, since I'm still thinking you also want to think about the long term, right? So the climate crisis is not something that we will solve within the next 10 years. This is something that at least we're going to be experiencing and dealing with maybe for the rest of our entire lifetime. So you also want to think about what's a sustainable basis for climate action. So is anxiety, this feeling of constant dread and constant worrying, is that a sustainable basis for action, is something that I have questions about.
Is it ethical?
Also, is it ethical? Of course, yes.
Stay worried and stay nervous worried all the time.
Yes, that's in itself, of course. Yeah, I almost didn't mention it because it seems almost stating the obvious, but obviously there's a huge ethical implication to this. If you wanted to make people feel more anxious, but even this question of should the anxious people stay anxious is quite controversial at the moment, because I've also seen if you recommend, for example, people who are experiencing climate anxiety, maybe we should help them through therapy. There are people who are very critical of this idea because they are saying that this is kind of giving up and in kind of making it seem as if people have strong levels of climate anxiety as if they are mentally ill, which is also not the implication that we want to give, because they are not. I mean, I've also stated this in my own articles. I don't think climate anxiety is indicative of mental illness, of course. No. But still, I mean, I have questions around, do we really need people to constantly experience this anxiety in order to get them to act? Because again, we know from the literature on environmental behavior that there are many factors that motivate people to engage in action. It's not just negative feelings and not just anxiety. And even though that can be a powerful force, it's not the only force. So I would be much in favor of also looking at, okay, what other maybe more sustainable bases of action do we have that we can also make use of to make sure that people can engage in climate action in a sustained and sustainable manner in that sense.
I think that's as optimistic as a spot as possible that we can end it on. It's an ongoing complex topic, but the idea of giving people a sense of like empowerment and hope is ideally, and one of the outcomes of, in my perspective, of environmental psychology as a scientist. That may not be the objective, but as a person, it's comforting to know that that's something people could get out of the research that you're doing, I think. So yes. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing all these insights about adaptation, mitigation, a little bit of everything.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Hey. The end.
Where's the plant?